So this is the last words, absolutely. The last words in this final chapter of Paul. He is imprisoned in Rome for the second time. Now, the first time, he actually was under just house arrest. And so he had to rent a house and probably had guest rooms, and it was a very relaxed environment. It was basically living in a house where he was, couldn't leave the house. But it wasn't by no means a horrible prison condition. And of course, he had his guys with him that were there to help him with the practical areas of life and of ministry. But then Paul, so the book of Acts ends where Paul is released from prison and he goes out and preaches the gospel freely. But we know that there was a second arrest. And this second arrest under Nero was harsh. And he was truly an inmate. And they threw him, basically what's today, you can go see it in Rome. It's a hole in the ground. It's called the Mamertine prison. And it was absolutely horrible and horrible conditions. And Paul was there in this place until he would stand before Nero and then eventually be beheaded. So we read verse 9 through 15. Be diligent to come to me quickly, talking to Timothy. In verse 21, we don't get there today, but he says, come quickly before winter. He adds the time frame. Get here quickly before winter. And then he goes on, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for the ministry. Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchments. Alexander, the coppersmith, did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works. You also must be aware of him, for he has greatly resisted our words. So he first tells Timothy, come to me quickly. Now, if you know 1st and 2nd Timothy, he was pastoring in the large church of Ephesus. And he didn't want to pastor. He wanted to be an apostle with Paul. But Paul basically encouraged him and commanded him to stay in Ephesus pastoring. But it was a stretching learning time for Timothy. And thankfully, Paul laid out how a church is to run. So without Timothy going through a difficult time in Ephesus, we would not have much needed instruction on how we are to be as a church. And the word diligent here in the Greek, it literally means to exert one to a very nth degree of your strength. In other words, I know it's not going to be easy, but push yourself and make it happen. Why? Paul was lonely. Paul was a man like you and I. He needed encouragement and affirmation. And he wanted his companion, his son in the faith, his good friend Timothy, to come and be with him before he would die. He wanted to see him before he would die. As we know historically, Timothy did not make it in time. Paul did not have Timothy there when he went through his court and was beheaded. And this is, again, just a practical reminder to each of us. We need each other, right? Just on a human level, we need those words of encouragement, of comfort, of affirmation. We need that touch. We need that hug. We need that person to grab us and hold us and pray for us. We need that in our lives. The Apostle Paul, a mighty, mighty man of God, needed those human things. I believe it from God because we're made in his image. In 1 Thessalonians 5:11, I like the way it reads in the NIV. Therefore, encourage one another and build up each other, just as in fact you are doing. And then in Galatians 6:2, bear with one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. In Hebrews 3:13, be encouraged one another daily, as long as it's called today, so that none of you have been hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. But he says, encourage one another. And of course, Paul does say much, and Jesus says much about visiting those in prison and those who are in prison who need that encouragement, especially when they've been arrested for the cause of Christ. Well, now we go to verse 10. And this is about those friends that have brought disappointment, that are not the friends that Paul thought they were. And in verse 10, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica, Chrysis for Galatia, and Titus for Dalmatia. So he says Demas, and it's a very strong word, to have forsaken. It's literally the word to abandon in time of need. It's a very strong word. To leave somebody's side when they're helpless. And that was Paul. Remember, he only had Luke there and evidently Demas. But the fire got too hot for Demas. There was always the chance in Rome to become guilty by association. Isn't that guy also one of your followers? What did Peter do when he was confronted? No, I've never met the guy. Well, I can tell you, actually, you're from Galilee. No, you're wrong. I don't know him. Never met him. They were afraid of that moment where the lawyer says, and here's a couple other guys that look like they're dressed from the same place Paul is, and let's have them come up to see if they're guilty too. No doubt there was that fear. But with Demas, it says he loved this present world. I do not know why I think this, but I think in my mind, absolutely not in the Bible, not in history, that some rich uncle died and he got a big inheritance. Now, the reason I say that is I have actually seen this a few times in my life, at least 3, maybe many more, but I can think of 3 offhand, where people that were of minimal means, but they were humble servants of the Lord. Their joy to life was church on Sunday. That was their focal point, like most of us who love the Lord and put God first at the first morning of the first day of the week. We want God to get our best. And then our week revolves around that. And then they get this influx of money. And let me tell you, sometimes it wasn't much. It was to them because of their position of having so little, But I've seen some get an inordinate amount of money and just saw humility change to zero humility. That sweet spirit they had disappeared. Now, I'm not saying this happens to everybody who gets an inheritance. I'm just saying I've seen it enough where all of a sudden they've got the money now to drive a nicer car, to have nicer clothes, and to go to hook up with a different group of people that they couldn't associate with before. But now they're in their same financial structure. They can, and they are, and they do, and then they walk away from the Lord. And in more than one case, they've ended up blowing it all, because they didn't know how to manage finances. And they came back, and they were that sweet person they were without the money. But I don't know why I think that. But either way, Demas, something happened where he could now go back and love the world to a very expensive place. Thessalonica was not a cheap place. It was a Roman city. So it would have been a very difficulty without an influx of money to do that. But he loved this present world. And it's interesting, if you look at the de-evolution of what is said about Demas in the letters, you sort of pick up onto it. For example, in the little one letter of Philemon, it says Demas and Luke, my fellow laborers. So Demas is right there next to Luke in quality of ministry and how he ministered to Paul. Luke, it doesn't appear he preached. He wrote 2 great letters, right? The book of Acts and the book of Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. But it seems like he was more of the practical type of ministry, where Demas evidently was in that too. But then in Colossians 4:14, it just says, Demas greets you. And then we have this, where now he goes from being a laborer to he's with us and he says hi, to now he's forsaken us. It's interesting because Paul, last week, we saw in verse 7, Paul said, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. And here was his great thing he did. I kept the faith. I wonder if he was thinking about Demas, where in just 2 verses ahead of this, in verse 7, he said, I can die in peace because I kept the faith to the end. I finished the race. So I don't think he's condemning Demas. I don't think he's saying this for anybody else to condemn Demas. I think he's saying it could happen to anybody. It could happen to any one of us. And the fact that he has decided to do that, it's Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10, there's no temptation that's not common to all of us, right? So he realizes that. In Hebrews chapter 3, a great exhortation for all of us to remember, because we don't know who's a Demas or going through a Demas season in our life. We may look at each other, how you doing? Great, man. And everything they say, all the buzzwords are there to make it sound like they're in love with the Lord, but you don't know once they leave church that they're drifting away like Demas was. But in Hebrews 3, he says exhortation to Demases and others who might be drifting away. In verse 12 through 15, beware, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, why it's called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. And then later in Hebrews 12, verse 12 through 13, therefore strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather be healed. So we need to come along and encourage one another why it's called day, especially if we sense there is a greater love for the world and less of a love for the things of God. And this is exactly what drew Demas away, was just a love for the present world. And he has departed. Jesus warned us about this. In Matthew 13:22, Jesus says, the word goes out and it falls on the street and falls on the thin soil, and it also falls amongst the weeds or the thorns. And he says, now he who receives seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and then the cares of this life, the deceitfulness of riches, Luke adds, and just a desire for other things. But these things choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. So he's not saying he lost his salvation. He's not saying he's going to hell. He's not saying I turned him over to Satan, that he should learn not to be so carnal. He's just saying he's at a low point right now, where the love of the world is greater than his love for God. Also to remind you, in the same book, Paul said the last days is going to be marked with people who love pleasure more than they love God, which is definitely what Demas did, but we're going to see it in a large number in these last days. John writes this in 1 John 2, verse 15 to 17, those getting swept up in heresy. He says, do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God, what? Abides forever. So abide. What does he say in 1 John 2:28, just a couple verses later? And now, 2:28, 1 John 2:28, and now, little children, abide in him, that when he appears, we may have confidence and not be ashamed before him at his coming. So it comes back to abiding. If there's a love of the world, you're going to stop abiding in Christ. And if Christ is not your treasure, then something of this world is going to become your treasure. Jesus said, where your treasure is, what? There your heart is also. And I've seen it where people begin to date non-Christians looking for a mate. And what happens is the guy puts his treasure in the girl, and the girl puts her treasure in the guy. And it seems to say, well, my greatest treasure is this girlfriend or this boyfriend. And now their treasure is on the things of this earth. And so the fact that they are not paddling in the same direction, they don't have the same spirit, they're not walking in one accord, it's sort of irrelevant, because the chief direction in my life is being taken by my heart and the love that's in my heart. And what it was a love for the world. Remember what Paul just said in the last verse we ended on last week. In 2 Timothy 4:8, he said, finally, there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness with the Lord, the righteous judge, who give to me on that day, and not to me only, but to all who what? Love his appearing. Demas loved the world. He wasn't able to disconnect from the love of this world, what he saw, what he heard, what he touched. And the love of the Father began to weaken in his life, and the love of the world got greater, which he could not abide any longer. And John says, abide in him. So when he appears, you don't shrink away in shame at his appearing. And Demas, in essence, is one that stopped the connection. I believe he was saved. I believed he probably had too much of the Lord in his life to enjoy the world and too much of the world to enjoy God. That's a miserable place to be in no man's land, isn't it? The prodigal son spent everything he had, didn't satisfy. Nothing satisfied. Boy, I love Moses. Thinking about Demas and the contrast of Demas with Moses. Remember in Hebrews 11:25-26, talking about Moses, it says, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Moses passed that test. He literally had comfort and wealth and power and royalty, and he was at the top of the top. But his desire for God was greater. And he didn't want anything to do with the pleasures of this life, that he could have the pleasure of God. He did not want to have the comfort of this life. He would rather have the difficulties of this life with the children of God. And his reward would not come by getting piles of gold in the bank or big sums of money and cattle. And he knew that his reward would never be on this earth, but his reward was in heaven. Well, now we skip down to verse 11 here. It says, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me in ministry. So the beloved Luke, we know him, don't we? This doctor that had been with Paul all along, always a quiet voice in the background. Even though we know he was with Paul when Paul shipwrecked 3 times. And then later in the book of Acts, a 4th time, Luke was with him. We also know that Luke was with him from the very beginning of his missionary journeys, or his second missionary journey. Paul says he was a beloved physician in Colossians 4:14, and Philemon 24, he called him a fellow laborer. He wrote the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke. And then we have Mark. Now, Mark was also joined with Paul on the missionary journey. Mark, we believe, is what is called John Mark. And he has deep roots at the very beginning of Christianity. Do you remember a few months after Jesus resurrected, Peter and Peter and James the apostle were arrested. You remember this? And James, his head was cut off. Always blows my mind. Jesus spent 3 years discipling James for only 6 months or so of ministry. But that night, the day before Peter was supposed to get the same treatment, an angel came and kicked him in the side and said, get out of here. And he thought it was a dream, that he's outside the prison walking around. And it says he went to the house of John Mark's mother. And sure enough, there was an all-night, 24-hour prayer meeting for Peter's release. And so we see him early on, very much a Jew and a follower of Peter, known Peter. Well, we discover in Colossians 4:10 that he's the cousin of Barnabas, or the nephew of Barnabas. A couple different references on which way you look at it. But remember, on the second missionary journey, he takes Mark along. So Barnabas said, hey, I want my nephew or my cousin to come along with us. And Paul's like, awesome, great. This young boy that goes right back to the very beginning. Now, Mark, remember, most believe he wrote the Gospel of Mark. And in the Gospel of Mark, there is this unnamed person who heard that Jesus was arrested. But he throws a sheet on his naked body because he was sleeping, and he runs out to sea. Do you guys remember this? And they tried to grab and arrest him, and he let go of his sheet, and he streaked home. Most believe that was Mark. So he was there, really at the foundations of Jesus' ministry and the crucifixion and the resurrection, no doubt there. But they get halfway on that missionary journey, and Mark says, they get to Pamphylia, and Mark says, I gotta go. And boy, that did not set right with Paul in particular. Well, later they're starting their third missionary journey, and Barnabas said, hey, Mark's gonna go with us again. And Paul said, no. He does not have the ability to be the kind of person that can handle what we handle, he's not going. And Barnabas said, no, he is. And it says there that Paul and Barnabas had a sharp contention. And Barnabas took Mark and he went to Cyprus. And Paul took Silas and Luke and others, and they went on their missionary journey. Now, tradition tells us that Peter became his discipler. It tells us in 1 Peter 5:13, he says, and I greet you as so does my son, Mark. So like Paul had Timothy, it appears that Peter had Mark, which I think could have been the reason he departed that first missionary journey. Because if Mark was wrestling with being a Jew first, as Peter did, do you remember what happened in Galatia? Peter, every time the Christians from Jerusalem came up and visited in Galatia, all of a sudden Peter got kosher. And as soon as they left the next morning, hey, I'll take some of that bacon. And even Barnabas got caught up in that hypocrisy. So it seems that Barnabas and Mark, in my estimation, as well as Peter, because finally, Paul just said, Peter, you've got a ministry to the Jews, but my ministry is to the Gentiles, and it's just going to look different and feel different, and you're not going to be comfortable with it, and I'm not comfortable with yours. So we decided that he would go with his ministry, and I blessed him in his ministry to the Jews, and he blessed me in my ministry to the Gentiles. But they realized they couldn't cohabitate. So I wonder if Mark was having those same Peter-type problems of being a Jew amongst the Gentiles and just said, this is too much. I don't think this is right. I think maybe we should be circumcising them, or at least they should keep the dietary laws of the Old Testament, or definitely they should be kosher. It seems like maybe that was the struggle they were going with. I don't know for sure. But when Paul writes the book of Philemon, he mentions that Mark was with him and was ministering to him. And now, in his second imprisonment, remembering how Mark was so helpful in his first imprisonment when Mark was there, he says, Timothy, when you come, bring Mark with you. I'm so thankful that we serve a God of the second chance. And I love the fact that Paul and Mark's fellowship was reinstated, restored. That's such a wonderful thing. But at the same time, the video camera went off of Barnabas. We don't know anything more about him. The video camera stayed on Paul. And that Paul's ministry is what we know about. So it seems in one sense that Barnabas maybe was wrong in this. Most people say, well, Barnabas was just so gracious, everybody loved him, and Paul was less gracious. That's the story. But I wonder if it just wasn't God's will. It just wasn't God's will for Barnabas and Mark, who had more of a Jewish flavor and followers of Peter. They needed to go there and do that rather than be at odds with Paul and his very Gentile ministry. Well, skipping back up to verse 10 and then looking at the verse 12 together, I want to look at a couple of other guys here. Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia, and then in verse 12, and Tychicus I've sent to Ephesus. So it seems like Crescens and Titus, they said, I need to go do this ministry, Paul. Love you, praying for you, but I got to go. And Paul said, bye-bye. But yet, Tychicus, he sent to Ephesus. Why? Because he wanted Timothy to come. So somebody needed to be there to pastor and oversee the church. And many think that. So to try to give you a little picture of it, we got a map for you today. Voila, map number one. So here is Italy, guys, and here is the foot right here, and here is Rome. Okay, yeah, this is right. What's that? Yes, where is Rome? Is that the foot of Rome there? Okay, no, hang on though, leave it there. Here's Greece. I believe that's correct. I believe this is Italy. This is the Aegean Sea, and this is Ephesus, and Troas is about here. This is the area of Galatia in Turkey today. Israel is down here, and then right here again is Europe. So up here is Constantinople or Istanbul today, and the bridge that goes across and takes you into Europe here. Okay, go to the other map and you'll see it. There's Cyprus, the island Cyprus. So there's Rome, okay, and here is the Adriatic Sea. That was the wrong map a minute ago, sorry. So here's the Adriatic Sea. So Paul's in Rome, and we have, this is the area of Galatia up here, which is in the middle of Turkey today. And here's Thessalonica. And so we read here, let me go back over here and read it. So Crescens goes to Galatia, which is this region up here, not a church. There we go. And Titus goes to Dalmatia. Let's look back at that same map. Same map. Go back to the same map. So right here, this is the coast of Dalmatia. This is you got Hungary, and then you got Croatia. And this, I've actually summered 3 different times right here on the coast in Dalmatia. Right here is Split, which is the capital, and a lot of historic things happened there in Split. But you go straight across and you're at Rome from Split. But so he sent, let me go look at my scriptures here. So Crescens he sent to Galatia, and Titus he sent to Dalmatia, or went to Dalmatia, and then Tychicus he sent down here to Ephesus. Okay? And then this up here would be Thessalonica, the church of Philippi, and those churches in, not Thessalonica, the churches in Europe. There we go, right there. And here's the island of Crete, and then we missed Israel's down this way more. So anyway, tried to give you, I needed to get different maps, I think, to make it a little clearer. There were so many to choose from, but hopefully that totally confuses you. That was the goal. Okay. So we do have these guys mentioned in the Bible. Titus, the very next book we're looking at, who was in the island of Crete. The last island I showed you is where Titus had been pastoring there. And then Tychicus in Ephesus. Tychicus was mainly the courier. He's the guy we have mentioned several times who's bringing the letter of Paul to all the various places, including to Timothy. And there's many things written about Tychicus. We see him several times mentioned in this scripture. And Paul calls him a beloved brother, a faithful minister, a fellow servant of the Lord, and many other things. Well, now we come to verse 13. Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas. Let's go back to the map one more time. Can we do that, Kirk? And so here we are. Okay, we're going to Troas. So here's Ephesus right here. Troas is right here. Now, do you remember that missionary journey where Paul had his big band with him, and they leave Antioch, which is right here. There's several Antiochs, but this is Antioch they leave. And they travel with this great host of great evangelists and missionaries and apostles. And God says, no, you can't speak. And then he goes up to Galatia. God says, no, you can't speak. He goes into Bithynia area. God says, no, you can't speak. And he finally just settles here at Troas. Do you remember? And then God speaks to him. And there is this guy from Macedonia over here in Europe who is saying, come here and help us. And he gets over there, and it's a lady, not a guy, Lydia, who's actually from Ephesus, which God works in mysterious ways. And then he started these churches here on the edge of Europe, which as far as Paul's ministry goes. So he tells Timothy, who's in Ephesus, to go to Troas, which wasn't a small trip, wasn't a short trip, and get his coat. And then evidently Mark might have been there as well. Grab Mark and bring him with you, and then come to Rome. So if you tried to travel this way, up and around, this way through Europe to Rome, that's about a year's journey. Okay? By horse, camel, however. If you were to come from Ephesus, you wouldn't travel from Troas, I don't think, but from Ephesus, you would take a boat to get to Rome. And if you do it before winter, as Paul says, it's anywhere from 2 months at the shortest to be up to 4 months. But if you go during that winter time, yeah, right here, Ephesus. If you go during that winter time, as Paul knows, who got shipwrecked 3 times, it could not go well. And so it's interesting that he tells him to go to Carpus's house in Troas to get that cloak and the books and the parchments. So what many speculate is, which I think is correct, Paul got arrested in Troas on the second arrest. We don't know this for a fact. But in the Roman laws, when the Roman soldiers arrested somebody, all of their possessions were the soldiers. It was their booty. They got to keep that. So Paul, rather than letting his cloak, probably a secondary cloak, a more one to keep you even warmer, a cloak on top of your coats, maybe like a poncho or something, and his parchment and books, which probably had great value, he gave them to this guy to hold so they didn't get stolen. But now that he's in prison, he can have these things brought to him as it's a gift, and he can keep them. Now, the question here is, couldn't Luke just go to the cloak store and buy him a cloak? Or somebody else? Why is it that he's having to wait till Timothy brings this cloak? Well, one is if he's going to get the parchments and the books, bring the cloak also. It's there with you. Or it could have some other greater significance. It might have been something he wanted Luke to have as a gift because Paul was going to die. Or maybe it was the garment Paul wanted to die in and be buried in. These are all possibilities. And it's sort of strange that it doesn't seem that at this point it was a cloak to keep him warm, but maybe it was a cloak later to keep him warm in the wintertime if it was needed. But what this tells us here is this. This is a good reminder that we need to consider the simple physical needs that people have. Paul gave everything to serve Christ. In his end of his life, he had very few possessions. He had completely forsaken all his friends, and his friends had forsaken him. And he was just an ordinary guy with an ordinary need, needing a cloak. Well, we end today in verse 15, or 14 and 15. Alexander the coppersmith did much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works. You also must beware of him, for he has greatly resisted our words. Now you might remember in chapter 1, 1 Timothy 1, verse 20, Paul mentions a guy who shipwrecked in regards to his faith, and Paul handed him over to Satan that he would learn not to blaspheme. In 1 Timothy 1:20, it says this, and of whom Hermogenes, and here it is, Alexander, whom I delivered to Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. So some think that this Alexander guy, who was a coppersmith, which usually was making idols, but maybe he went to doing something else, that now his heresy and had a group of followers, that they were actually really hurting Paul, maybe to the point of traveling to Rome to testify against him. And Paul is saying, this guy has money, he has followers, he has clout, and he is mean, and I'm sure today he would be a Democrat. Those kind of things. Remember I told you earlier? And he warns him that you need to be aware of him and what's going on. Psalms 62:12 in the NIV, I like how it says, with you, Lord, is unfailing love, and you reward everyone according to what they have done. Paul doesn't say, I hate this guy, I hope he burns in hell. He doesn't say he's not a Christian. He just simply saying what he's doing is foolish and hurtful to me and my ministry. And since you are by association with me, Timothy, no doubt he may also try to bring false things against you as well. Now, I have seen many times, I've had to help pastors out. More than one time, Chuck called me and asked me to minister to somebody in our region to go to try to help them and their church through a difficult time and give him updates on it. But I've seen it myself where people who were once great friends of the pastor and of the church, something got stuck in their craw and their brains just sort of flipped. And they just started saying horrible things about the church and about the pastor. And some of them were just brutal, which, again, you would think nobody would believe it, but yet there's always a percentage of people that will get spooked. There's always a percentage of the sheep that'll run when they hear fire. But I've seen them say of the pastor that he is womanizing, to stealing money, to, the commentaries he reads are that of heresy, and that he has read the book on Hitler on how to give good oratory and, all kinds of things. I mean, just a whole smidret of things. And I would have to chase them down and talk to this guy going, you know what, 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact is established, tell me. And I'll tell you what, 90% of the time they're like, well, I don't even really think the pastor did it. I just got so mad I said that. And it's like, well, you need to get the word out that that's the fact because you have shaken people's faith. And let me tell you, Jesus said, it'd be better for you to put a stone around your neck and throw yourself in the ocean than to stumble one of these little ones. But you've stumbled people from going to church now. And if they do go to church somewhere else, they're always going to have this thing in the back of their mind wondering if this new pastor is as bad as the last pastor. Interesting, when I first started pastoring, within the first few months, Jimmy Swaggart fell. And then a short time after that, the PTL group, Tim and Jamie Baker fell, and a few of them. And here I was, 24 years old, been pastoring a few months, and everybody's giving me the eye, like, And I talked to everybody was like that. Everybody in the church was suspicious of, was there a secret life behind the pastor? And we just had to walk through it. But it was a very miserable few years. And then when people started coming back, it was again having to gain that trust again. So I don't know what this guy was up to, but Paul didn't wish him ill, but he did say, God is gonna, people that want to divide the church, 6 things God hates, yea, the 7th is an abomination, to bring division amongst God's people, Proverbs 6 says. And Paul, like Jesus, just said, Father, into your hands, I give this to you. You deal with it as you will. And that's all you can do. And I have seen people that have done me great harm. And years later, they come back. They're now living somewhere else, and they visit. And they come back and give me a hug and talk to me like nothing ever happened. And so glad to see that things are great. And they always say this, it's so good to have seen you grow so much, Bryan. It was a backwards, that's why you were so screwed up back then type thing. And I would just like, you know what, I had just given it all into the hands of God. I have nothing in my heart against anyone. I could love them and overlook that and just keep going. But Paul here, it's a matter of life and death. It seems like this guy was part of the reason Paul was found where he was found, arrested where he was arrested, and this guy now is going to make sure that Paul dies for being a heretic in his mind. In Romans 12:17, Paul says this, repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. I love that. Don't repay evil for evil. Timothy, I'm saying, hate this guy, give him a cold shoulder, do anything evil. I'm just saying, be aware. So if he tries to buddy up with you and take you to lunch, and I've seen that as well, where people try to buddy up with you, really to stab you in the back while they got you somewhere. Don't say no. Stay away from that guy. In Romans 12:19, Paul says, beloved, do not avenge yourself, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And Jesus gave us the best advice, the best wisdom in Matthew 10:16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Get an amen for that? Therefore, be wise as serpents, but harmless, innocent, gentle as doves. So don't be like a dumb sheep that has no idea he's sniffing around, a wolf's cave. Understand there's wolves out there. There are people that genuinely hate Jesus, hate Christianity, and they hate you for that. And Satan is a pro at manipulating people from within. What did Paul say to the Ephesus church? I fear for you now that I'm leaving, that those in the church and from without who want to bring you into their proselytization and then pervert the gospel of Christ and you follow them. I have a great fear that's for sure going to happen. Sometimes Satan spends years manipulating, setting things up, getting bitter people. 99.99% of the time, these people who cause problems, cause division, and I am sure that this copper maker, Alexander, was the same. They had a bitter relationship with their dad. It's amazing. Bitterness. When I would go to a board that was hating on the pastor, and after they would spew all of their stuff, some of these pastors I knew very, very well, and it was like, this is absolutely not. It's the opposite of who they are. But I would listen to it, and then I would simply ask, how is your relationship with your dad? How is your relationship with your dad? Every single time, 100%, they would say, well, I never got along with my dad. And when I would start asking the questions, they were still bitter towards their dad. Let me tell you what happens when you're bitter towards your dad. The next person in authority over you, that bitterness goes on them. So if it's a teacher or a boss or in the military, and you keep destroying relationships because that bitterness will creep back up to the top, and you see that boss as the same horrible, evil guy as my dad. Now, they haven't necessarily made those connections. And then this guy over me in the military, he is the horriblest person that's ever lived, and that's why I got to get out of the Navy. And this college I went to, this professor, he's the biggest idiot. And the guy, and then if they make it to church, guess what happens? It all comes on the pastor who's in an authority over their life. And this is often the very key of why marriages break apart, is because there's that unresolved issue of bitterness. And especially if somebody, a lot of these guys looked at Paul like their father in the faith. I remember being at a pastor's conference, and one of Chuck's assistants got up and said, guys, and there's probably 3,000 pastors there. He said, guys, Chuck loves you all, but he has 4 kids and he can't have 3,000 more. Don't have the expectation that Chuck can be there personally for every single one of you. It's impossible. But there were guys getting bitter and leaving the Calvary movement because they had an expectation that Chuck couldn't fulfill. Now, I do not know what was happening on that. I know Chuck saw me as a son, and that was plenty fine with me and Chuck. But that was a joke. Anyway, so what did we learn today? Number 1, we need each other. Jesus placed us into a body of Christ. He didn't put us in a solo camp, did he? Now that you're saved, you're by yourself up here in the woods. Be a hermit for Christ. No, he placed us in a body of Christ. Secondly, we need to be thankful for those who stay faithful to us and the church and the ministry. And we had our board meeting last night, and Jenny and Kirk and Dennis and my wife were there and just said, on behalf of the church, thank you guys. Thank you for being there for these guys. I mean, Dennis has been here 28 years now, right? And for many of them, well over 20 years, just plugging away, being faithful. And then the third thing is we need to continually encourage each other, because we don't really know if somebody is about to be dislocated. We don't know if their feet or their hands are hanging down or about dislocated unless God gives us a word of knowledge on that. We just need to assume that everybody is faltering or struggling or needs encouragement, because we always do, don't we? And the fourth thing is we have real enemy Satan, and he is able to manipulate people in the church and outside the church to attack us and hurt us. We need to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves.